Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. The problems of Europe and the problems of Asia became America's problems on December 7th, 1941, the day that will live in infamy. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have three objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to explain how the United States got involved in World War II. You should be able to outline the course of World War II after the United States entered the war. You should be able to examine the way in which the United States mobilized its economic resources and promoted popular support for the war effort. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 14. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 14. On September of 1939, Roosevelt persuaded Congress to pass a cash and carry provision that the United States would sell weapons to warring nations as long as they paid cash and transported them on their own ships, thus keeping the United States out of war. This was a way of dealing with the restrictions that were placed in the United States after World War I. You'll remember, of course, that one of the reasons we got into World War I was that some of our allies, or truly nations on both sides, but more importantly the Entente side, had been buying a lot of goods from the United States and owed a fair amount of money for those. So we ended up with kind of an economic interest in reaching World War I to make sure that our debts were paid. Well, there was a real feeling that that couldn't happen again, and so Congress had passed laws that kept us out of stuff like that. But Roosevelt urged them to pass the cash and carry provision, saying, well, what if they don't owe us money? What if they just paid cash for the goods? And we don't even endanger American sailors along the way. They transported to their own ships. That's the cash and carry rule. In 1941, Roosevelt urged Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act, hoping to use the full arsenal of democracy to go support Britain against the Axis powers. The Lend-Lease Act said, well, we're not going to go sell military goods to Great Britain, but what if they borrowed some of our battleships or, could rent a few tanks for a little bit? I mean, it's not selling it. It's not a, violation of our law. That was the Lend-Lease Act. Also, it would freeze Japanese assets. Basically, the Japanese business interests in the United States, we would hold those and freeze them, saying that, that's a country that we don't like the way they're acting, so we're going to tie up essentially their money in America. We're going to tie it up in America. And also to stop trade with Japan, that we wouldn't do any business with Japan while they were currently at war. The United States was Japan's largest supplier of fuel and supplies. Even after Japan's alliance with Germany, they were still reliant on American exports. In response to Japanese aggression in Asia, the United States cut off trade with Japan. In August of 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill had secretly met to discuss the terms under which the United States would enter World War II. Roosevelt noted that he didn't have the political support to just join in the war, but he promised he would do everything he could to force an incident. Together they issued the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter was the declaration of war aims. It became eventually the basis of the Declaration of the United Nations, a group known as the Allies, a 26-nation team that Roosevelt noted that contained essentially 80% of the human race was part of this alliance. Subpoint B. By 1941, the United States had broken Japanese codes, and we were pretty much openly translating all of the transmissions, and realized that Japan was planning to attack American soil. But we were uncertain of where and when the attack might happen. Roosevelt said, though, that if the two countries were going to fight, it would have to be Japan that strikes first. And December 7th of 1941, the day that will live in infamy, the Japanese Empire attacked Pearl Harbor, and in doing so killed 2,402 Americans and wounding another 1,178. Over 300 aircraft and 21 ships were destroyed or damaged, and in 2 hours' time, the United States Navy suffered more losses than it did in the entirety of World War I. On December 8th, the next day, Roosevelt addressed Congress to ask for a declaration of war against Japan. Congress approved the request, and 3 days later, Germany and Italy, in support of their Axis allies, declared war on the United States, and the United States entered World War II. Roman numeral number 15. Here we're going to talk about how we lay out our plans for going into the war. And it happens when Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, comes to the White House on December 22nd of 1941. And there he spent the next 3 weeks living in the White House and working with Roosevelt and his advisors, how basically the United States would enter the war effort. Churchill believed that Germany and Italy posed a far greater threat to both countries than Japan did, and convinced Roosevelt to first go strike against Hitler. And then once the Allies had gained an upper hand in Europe, they could pour both their combined resources into the Pacific War. At the end of their meeting, Roosevelt and Churchill had formed a very strong friendship, and in the words of Churchill, it was a very strong affection in which grew our years of comradeship. When Churchill reached London, he found a message from the president waiting for him there saying, "It is fun to be in the same decade as you." Even though these two world leaders were separated by a continent, they quickly had a quick friendship and a united war aims that would transcend questions of the war into just world leaders who got each other, who just understood each other. Subpoint B. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler ordered submarine raids against ships along America's east coast. The German aid in what was known as the Battle of the Atlantic, their aim was to prevent food and war materials from reaching Great Britain and the Soviet Union, who were, of course, fighting against Germany. Great Britain depended on supplies from the sea. Their 3,000-mile-long shipping lanes from the United States, that was the lifeline of the nation. Hitler knew that if he could cut that lifeline, Britain would be essentially starved into submission. And for a long time, it looked as if Hitler might succeed in this mission. Unprotected American ships were easy targets for Japanese U-boats. And in the first 4 months of 1942, Germans sank 87 ships along the Atlantic shore. 7 months into the war, German wolf packs had sank another 681 Allied ships in the Atlantic, and something had to be done pretty quickly, otherwise the whole war would be lost at sea before we ever really got committed to the thing. The Allies responded by organizing their ships into convoys, not unlike we did in World War I. They were groups of ships that would travel together for mutual protection. The convoys were escorted across the Atlantic by destroyers equipped with sonar for detecting submarines underwater. They were accompanied by airplanes overhead with radar used to spot U-boats on the ocean's surface. And with this improved tracking, the Allies were able to find and destroy German U-boats faster than the Germans could build them. By late spring of 1943, Admiral Dönitz, the commander of the German U-boat offensive, had to report that his losses were reaching an unbearable height and they had to call off the U-boat attacks against the convoys. Meanwhile, the United States was launching a large shipbuilding program. Our Navy had been largely scuttled after World War I, and so we had to build it as quickly as we could. And by early of 1943, 140 Liberty ships were produced each month, and Allied ship launchings eventually began to outnumber sinkings, and the Navy was growing again. By mid-1943, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic had turned, and happy Churchill reported to the House of Commons in June that June was the best month at sea from every point of view we have ever known in the 46 months of the war, and that takes us to subpoint C. By winter of 1943, the Allies began to see victories on land as well as on sea. The first great turning point came in what was known as the Battle of Stalingrad. The Germans had been fighting in the Soviet Union since 1941. It's the thing that broke the Nazi-Soviet pact. And by November of 1941, the bitter cold had stopped them in their tracks outside the cities of Moscow and Leningrad. When spring came, the German tanks were ready to roll, and in the summer of 1942, Germans took offensive in the Soviet Union. There, Hitler hoped to capture the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus Mountains. He also wanted to wipe out Stalingrad, which was a major industrial city on the Volga River, and kind of an extra prize, because Stalin had named it after himself. The German army confidently approached Stalingrad in August of 1942, and used the old blitzkrieg techniques, with the Luftwaffe prepared the way by nightly bombing raids over the city. Nearly every wooden building in the city of Stalingrad was burnt to the ground. The situation looked so desperate that Soviet officers in Stalingrad recommended what they should do is just retreat. They should just blow up what's left of the city and retreat before Hitler could take any more of it. And Stalin, furious at this idea, said, "No, this is my city." He demanded that Stalingrad be defended no matter what the cost was. And for weeks, Germans pressed in on Stalingrad, conquering it house by house in a brutal hand-to-hand combat. By the end of September, they looked like they were going to be successful, controlling 9/10 of the city, or whatever was left of it. And then the winter set in. The Soviets saw the cold as an opportunity to roll fresh tanks across the frozen landscape and beginning a huge, massive counterattack. The Soviet army closed in around Stalingrad, trapping the Germans in and around the city and cutting off their supplies. This is kind of an interesting thing. It's a Soviet city, but the Germans had taken over 9/10 of it. So they're occupying a Soviet city, and then the Soviets come and lay siege on their own city because they trapped the Germans inside of it. The Soviets have a strong advantage to them, and it's the Russian winter. There's an old line in military history that says that Russia's three greatest generals are December, January, and February. The fighting continued as winter turned Stalingrad into a frozen wasteland, and the German commander had to ultimately surrender in January 31st of 1943. 2 days later, his starving troops also surrendered. In defending Stalingrad, the Soviets paid a huge price. A total of 1.1 million soldiers all died in the battle, more than the American deaths in the entire war. Stalin lost more of them in one battle in his namesake city. Despite a staggering death toll, the Soviet victory marked the turning point in the war, and from that point on, the Soviet army began moving westward and pushing now towards Germany. That brings us to subpoint D. While the Battle of Stalingrad raged, Stalin pressured Britain and America to open a second front in Europe. Stalin had argued that an invasion across the English Channel would force Hitler to divert troops from the Soviet front. Churchill and Roosevelt didn't think the Allies could do that. They didn't think they had the troops to go attempt an invasion into Europe. Instead, they launched what was known as Operation Torch, an invasion of Axis-controlled North Africa, here commanded by the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower. In September of 1942, around 107,000 Allied troops, the great majority of them were Americans, landed in Casablanca, Iran, and Algiers in North Africa. From there, they sped eastward, chasing the Africa Corps, led by General Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox. After months of heavy fighting, the last of the Africa Corps surrendered in May of 1943. Subpoint E. Even before the Battle of North Africa was won, Churchill, Roosevelt, and their commanders met in Casablanca. After this meeting, the two leaders agreed to accept only the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. Essentially, the Nazis had to be broken. The Axis Nazis, the Italians, the members of the Axis had to be broken entirely. Unconditional surrender. The game was over. That is, the enemy nations would have to accept whatever terms of peace the Allies dictated. It would not be a negotiated peace. The two leaders discussed where to go strike next. The Americans argued that the best approach to victory was to assemble a massive invasion fleet in Great Britain and to launch it across the English Channel through France into the heart of Germany. I think Stalin would have liked this idea. Churchill, though, thought it would be safer to go first attack Italy. The Italian campaign got off to a good start with the capture of Sicily in the summer of 1943. And when basically the Italian army just collapsed in Sicily, and the Italian government forced Benito Mussolini to resign, essentially saying, hey, you're Il Duce, you promised victory, and they fold. They just totally collapsed in Sicily, and now they're going to move on to the peninsula. And basically the Italians were tired of putting up with Mussolini's nonsense if he wasn't going to prove victorious on the battlefield as well. On July 25th, 1943, King Victor Emmanuel III summoned Il Duce to his palace, and there he stripped him of his power, had him arrested, said, at this moment, you're the most hated man in Italy. Italians began to cheer what looked like the end of the war. Their cheers were premature, though. Hitler was determined to stop the Allies in Italy rather than fight on German soil. The longer that Italy could sustain, the battle, the safer that would keep Germany. One of the hardest battles the Allies encountered in Europe was fought in less than 40 miles from the city of Rome, known as the Bloody Anzio. It lasted 4 months until the end of May of 1944 and left around 25,000 Allied and around 30,000 Axis casualties. During the year after Anzio, Nazi armies continued to put up strong resistance. The effort to free Italy didn't actually succeed until 1945, when Germany was close to collapse. Italy essentially turned into a guerrilla war. And guerrilla wars are very hard to win. They sustain for a really long time on both sides. Roman numeral number 16. Let us turn our eyes homeward bound to see what's going on back on the home front. To keep up with the demands for war, Roosevelt created new federal agencies like the War Production Board and the War Manpower Commission and the Office of Price Administration. These agencies regulated labor and controlled shipping and manufacturing and fixed the price of goods and wages. The government built housing for war workers and civilian industries, basically forced them to go retool for war production. Subpoint B, Roosevelt offered incentives to go spur on this production, low interest loans and tax concessions and contracts with guaranteed profits, and the biggest companies got the biggest contracts because they were in the position to go make the biggest contribution. Americans produced an astonishing amount of wartime goods. Science and technology made huge leap forwards. Thousands of airplanes, 100,000 armored vehicles, 2.5 million trucks. There was so much demand for rubber to go make the tires, but rubber is a natural product. It's made from a rubber tree. It grows in a tropical area, and Japan actually controlled most of the world's rubber tree crop. So the Americans figured out how to make synthetic rubber on a huge scale. and it replaced natural rubber to go do so. Also, technologies like radar and jet engines and early computers would result from this public-private type of cooperation in the war effort. Towns with defense industries, they profited huge. They saw 2 or 3 times population growth. The West Coast emerged as a focus of military industrial production. The South was focused on war material, like raw materials. Raw materials never produce profits at the same rate as finished goods, so it's an industry for the South, but it's no surprise to me that the South languishes in profits and actually continues to languish economically even after the war was over. Subpoint C. In contrast to the Depression, and here we see the transition from the Great Depression to a robust economy, World War II was a good era for working people. Defense industries were booming and unemployment fell to 1.2% in 1944. Just a few years earlier, I mean, it was 10, a few years before that, almost 25%. 1.2% unemployment is essentially full employment. Anybody who wants a job can find one, and if you're out of a job, you won't be for long. The farm prosperity coincided with good weather. There was no drought or dust storms like in the 1930s. Crop production rose 50% and farm income tripled, and there was easy ways to go place all of that demand for food. Farmers and workers at home felt like they were part of the war effort and contributing for American success. Over 6 million women entered the workforce at the time, a third of which were jobs in defense factories, and that's a major amount of women entering the workforce that had previously not had significant employment outside the home. Subpoint D. Freedom and patriotism were closely linked, and to go support all of this effort took, I think we could say, a propaganda effort on behalf of the Roosevelt administration. Talk of freedom dominated wartime America, and Roosevelt insisted that all people in all nations would share America's entitled to what he called the 4 freedoms. These 4 freedoms in the Rooseveltian understanding was a freedom of speech and expression, a freedom to worship God in his own way. And then the next 2 I think are interesting. Rhetorically, they're still the freedoms, but they're no longer freedoms of, they become freedoms from want. Now, this was an ambiguous goal, like what is freedom from want, but it resonated very strongly with people who had been living in the Great Depression. And also freedom from fear. I think of this one as like being, echoing the George W. Bush promise of a war on terror. Like, how do you get freedom from fear? Roosevelt said that everybody hopes for that same thing, though. The Office of War Information was created in 1942 to move opinions of people in favor of the war. The office carefully crafted the Second World War. Its message is a story of people in a war of freedom rather than as payback to the Japanese for Pearl Harbor. The Office of War Information believed that the war should be seen as a fight against fascism, but they really wanted to carefully avoid kind of like frankly, the racism that came out from World War I. Using a vast array of media, propagandists showed opposition to the enemy and built support for American allies. They urged greater public support for war production and for victory gardens. They persuaded people to save some of their materials so more materials could be used for the war effort, and would go sell war bonds. And patriotism became the central theme of advertising. Like, just to be a good American meant to be a patriotic American. Large-scale campaigns were launched to go sell war bonds and basically go into debt to go finance the war, to promote efficiency in factories, to reduce ugly rumors, and to maintain civilian morale. Subpoint E, a growing wartime economy and a shortage of working-age men opened up the doors for women at work. Known as Rosie Riveters, by 1944, women made up over a third of the civilian labor force. The war meant a dramatic social change for women, as millions of fathers in the armed forces meant that mothers were out raising families alone. Working mothers meant that kids were left with neighbors and families, and welcome to the large-scale use of daycares. Speedy wartime marriages before shipping overseas weren't uncommon, and there was real changes for family life and changes for women. And the changes for society were just getting started in a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.